One of the features of the official poverty rate and the anchored SPM that we just considered is that the poverty threshold must be adjusted over time to account for changes in the overall price level or inflation. Earlier, we spent some time learning how to use a standard price index to make adjustments when we want to compare two nominal economic variables, such as poverty thresholds or income, across different years. It turns out, however, that the way these price indices are constructed can be important to our conclusions about poverty as well. The CPI has long been one of the standard price indices produced and used in the U.S. Like many similar indices, it suffers from a flaw that can lead it to overstate the amount of inflation that occurs in a given year. This problem is known as substitution bias, and it comes from the fact that, as a particular good becomes more expensive, consumers will tend to substitute away from it. To understand the problem, we need to understand a bit about how the Consumer Price Index is calculated. It is based on a weighted average of a typical market basket of goods and services purchased by U.S. households. More specifically, it is the ratio of this market basket valued at current prices over the same market basket of goods valued at the price levels that prevailed in an earlier base year. Only by holding the composition of the market basket constant can the CPI isolate the effect of changing price levels. Holding the composition of the market basket constant, however, creates a problem as well. This is because, as consumers, we adapt to rising prices by substituting away from goods with particularly sharp price increases. This means that a price index that holds the market basket constant will tend to overstate how much actual costs have gone up, since it ignores these substitution possibilities. Studies of the CPI-U, which is used to update the official poverty measure thresholds, confirm that this index likely overstates the increase in the cost of living over time. Some estimate by up to 1% per year. Why does this matter for measuring poverty? The idea behind an absolute poverty measure such as the OPM is that it keeps the threshold or standard for what constitutes poor fixed over time. If, however, adjustments made for inflation actually over-adjust, that is equivalent to increasing the real level of resources needed in each year to escape poverty. Statisticians and economists have attempted to address the problems in the CPI and have produced several alternative indices that address these problems. This figure shows the comparison between the measure currently used to adjust poverty thresholds for the OPM, called the CPI-U, shown in the top line, and several alternatives. The most conservative adjustment shown here is something known as the CPI-U-RS for Research Series, which many believe addresses the issue of substitution bias and avoids overestimating inflation. As shown here, these fairly small adjustments can make a big difference over a period of 20 to 30 years. The adjusted series suggests that price levels have gone up by a factor of roughly 5.5 times since 1970, compared to 6.3 times for the CPI-U measure. This seemingly small technical matter makes an important difference to conclusions about how poverty has trended over time. To see this, consider an approximate adjustment of the 1970 poverty threshold by the two CPI series. In 1970, the poverty threshold for a family of four was approximately $4,000. Using a factor of 6.2, suggested by the CPI, would convert that into a 2013 threshold of nearly $25,000, but using the adjusted CPI-U research series and a factor of 5.5 gives a 2013 threshold of just $21,800. This slide shows how this issue affects conclusions about trends in poverty rates. Two of the lines in this figure show poverty rates adjusted for inflation using the CPI-U, and the other two use the CPI-U-RS. The traditional CPI measure suggests the U.S. official poverty rate went from 12% in 1972 to 12.2% in 2005. In contrast, those using the CPI-U-RS show poverty declining from around 14% in 1972 to roughly 11% in 2005. So this module has shown another reason for caution in interpreting trends over time based on our official poverty measure. We may be systematically overstating inflation in the way our official measure is updated for price changes, causing an impression of stable poverty rates when there may actually have been substantial improvements. We've seen in the past few modules that describing and understanding trends in U.S. poverty rates can be complex. The official poverty measure shows little movement in the U.S. poverty rate over several decades. This can be explained by the rise in female-headed households, economic growth coupled with rising inequality and stagnant wages, and cash welfare programs that have provided smaller benefits to fewer of the poor over time. In contrast, looking at poverty over time using the alternative supplemental poverty measure does show substantial declines in poverty since the 1970s. Finally, we saw that even the official poverty measure may show declining rates of poverty, depending on the details of exactly how we adjust for price level changes.